Well, welcome everyone. It's February 10th, and believe it or not, this is our first workshop talk of the spring 2022 semester. Welcome, my name is Heather Bowling. I am the research and program coordinator at the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History. I'm going to ask that at the beginning here, if you could, except for Dr. Stewart, if you could please turn off your audio and video, and then after our talk, I will invite you to turn everything back on. This workshop talk series began several years ago as a way for our fellows and faculty to test new ideas and research in a small seminar-like setting of like-minded colleagues. Since then, the series evolved to include scholars from all over the globe who would join us at our research center at the Dallas Museum of Art or in our seminar room on campus for presentations of new work, typically followed by rigorous conversation and feedback, capped off by a wine reception in the joy of Rick Bertel, who loved these wine receptions after our workshop talks. Like everyone else, the spring semester of 2020 brought many changes to the way we do things. And while our shift to the virtual realm has had its challenges, in many ways it has widened the scope of our audience for these talks. This evening, I'm pleased to see friends and colleagues from all over the US and beyond, and I look forward to an energetic discussion following our speaker this evening. In the coming months, you'll see our workshop talk series take many forms. Tonight, it's virtual, but soon, hopefully in person or hybrid. To stay informed of what is happening at the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History, please check our events page, our Instagram or Facebook, or join our mailing list if you haven't already. And you can email me at heather.bowling@utdallas.edu if you'd like to be added. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Whitney Stewart, who is an assistant professor of history and faculty in the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. An historian of the 19th century US South, her work focuses primarily on slavery, plantations, and material culture. Her first monograph, This Is Our Home, The Struggle for Home Place on Southern Plantations, is under advanced contract with the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Stewart is also the author of articles in Winterthur Portfolio and Journal of Social History, as well as co-editor of the anthology Race and Nation in the Age of Emancipations from the University of Georgia Press in 2017. Her research and writing has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and many others. Whitney also teaches and writes about public history and museums and has served as a fellow at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston Bayou Bend Collection and the Henry Ford Museum. Her talk is titled A Vigorous Crusade Against the One-Room Cabin, Black Activists, Usable History, and Anti-Historic Preservation in the Jim Crow Era. Welcome to Whitney Stewart. And if anyone has their audio on, be sure that it is off, please, so that we don't hear the background noise. Thank you so much. And Ashley, if you wouldn't mind turning your video off too, please. And we'll turn them back on at the end for discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Heather. I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me since I can't see your faces right now. And just to echo, I do see a couple of people that still have their mics unmuted, so if you wouldn't mind muting those. So this, by the way, title is a work in progress, as is this entire thing I'm talking about today. What I'm workshopping is something I'm writing right now, an essay for an edited collection on race and the historiography of American architecture. Now, as Heather noted, I am a historian, not an architectural historian. So the way that I'm approaching this topic is likely going to be quite different than that of other contributors to the anthology. But I think I can make a contribution that will complicate the way that we think and talk about something that's central to architectural history, historic preservation of the built environment, and particularly for this edited collection, the way race has shaped those conversations. Now, I have what I think is a really interesting story supported by ample research. And I know I'm onto something, but I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that something is. So today I want to first set the scene about how I came to this essay, then delve into what the primary sources tell us, and end by offering some conclusions about what this history might tell us about the anthology's topic. And I am, of course, open to hearing your thoughts and recommendations about what all of this adds up to. So what led this cultural historian to want to write an essay and a book about architectural history? Well, it originated in a tension between my historical work in the archives and my historical work outside of them. I started to find evidence in the primary sources of a story that I hadn't read about before. Black activists and institutions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries calling for their brethren to rid the Southern landscape of the architectural remains of slavery. Now, at the same time, I was interacting with museum and historic preservation professionals in the present day who were pursuing the work of preserving the same buildings in history that those in the past were looking to get rid of. So I was experiencing this kind of whiplash regarding what to do with these houses, depending on where in time, whether 1895 or 2015, my historian's brain was. So in 2015, I was a dissertation research fellow at the Smithsonian's then not yet finished National Museum of African American History and Culture, where they were just finalizing the acquisition of this cabin from Point of Pines Plantation in Charleston County, South Carolina. Now, this was a pretty incredible find, a relatively well-preserved 19th century cabin that had housed Black Southerners from the era of slavery into the 1970s. Now, no one famous had lived there. Nothing groundbreaking had happened there, but the Smithsonian wanted it badly. They actually wanted it to be central to the new museum. Smithsonian Magazine called it the crown jewel of the new museum. NMAHC saw this slave cabin as a crucial part of the history of African Americans and a particularly useful way of narrating that past. This acquisition and its central place in the highly anticipated museum was seen as a win for the slave cabin preservation movement that was at that time building momentum. Now, the historic preservation movement, one that for nearly its entire history has been overwhelmingly white and focused on preserving structures associated with white Americans, has, as one of the leading Black historic preservationists and scholars, Brent Leggs, notes, quote, often neglected and undervalued Black sites, thus the necessary movement to preserve them. For centuries, slave cabins had disappeared from the Southern landscape due to environmental catastrophes, development, and lack of care or interest by white property owners. And little had been done to actively promote a national reckoning with this vanishing history. But in the early 2010s, Joseph McGill, a public historian in Charleston, South Carolina, started the Slave Dwelling Project, whose mission was to promote the preservation of slave cabins. In the year I was a fellow at the Smithsonian, I attended the Slave Dwelling Project conference, where activists, artists, academics converged to discuss how best to preserve the relatively few remaining slave cabins in the Southern landscape. That year, I also drove down from Washington to Charlottesville, Virginia, to meet with Joby Hill, architectural historian and preservationist, who was then helping to restore and rebuild slave cabins on Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation. And Hill was also in the process of establishing what is now called the Saving Slave Houses Project, which seeks to document every extant slave dwelling in the country, and in the process work to save them. The Smithsonian, the Slave Dwelling Project, and the Saving Slave Houses Project were just three of several organizations who in the 2010s were arguing for the necessity of saving slave dwellings. They and others pushed institutions like the National Park Service and the National Trust for Historic Preservation to take slave dwellings more seriously, to put money into preserving what they argued were elemental architectural remains of the American past. Public history and historic preservation groups called for more focus on ensuring that the history of Black and other marginalized Americans be maintained and integrated into the American narrative. And it worked to an extent. Over the past 10 years, we've seen historical sites, particularly historic plantation sites that had slave dwellings located on their property. They've had to grapple with the inaccurate and unjust interpretations of the past that their sites had been giving the public. And part of that reckoning was a new dedication to presenting the history of slavery and enslaved people on the site, which also meant preserving the buildings that they had called home. This preservation work is seen as urgent because these buildings are part of a political project. They are important historical sources, yes, but these preservationists of slave cabins believe that they have the power to do much more. The Slave Dwelling Project, for instance, sees these slave dwellings as a kind of usable history that helps to tell, quote, a more truthful and inclusive narrative of the history of the nation that honors the contributions of all our people. Changing that narrative can, they believe, help change our nation. For in preserving slave dwellings, the project means to, quote, engage people in honest conversations about slavery, race, racism, and racial equity in search of improved racial relations. Like many historic preservationists, therefore, they see their work as today and tomorrow oriented, of finding a usable history that will aid us in our present and in our future. Architect Paul Bentel, for instance, asserts that historic preservation is rooted in the issues of heritage politics in the present, while the National Park Service goes further to declare, quote, historic preservation is a conversation with our past about our future. In other words, we preserve what we want of the past in order to make the present better and build the kind of future we want. So in 2015, I was engaging with this slave cabin preservation movement at the Smithsonian, at the Slave Dwelling Project Conference, at Monticello Plantation and beyond. And yet, when I was doing what I was being given money to do at the Smithsonian, researching in a dark and dingy basement, I kept finding evidence of a very different approach, one from the late 19th and early 20th centuries as what should be done with these slave cabins. Get rid of them. I remembered back to the conversations I had had with activists and scholars about why these buildings were no longer in our landscape. And to my surprise, these calls were not coming from white supremacists who wanted to erase the Black built environment in the Southern landscape. Rather, these calls were coming from some of the era's most prominent and influential Black Americans, Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee Institute, W.E.B. Du Bois and Hampton Institute Southern Workman Journal, Mary Church Turrell and the National Association of Colored Women. So I sat in that museum basement, puzzled. Why would these Black Americans want to do away with the same dwellings that Joe McGill, Joby Hill, the Smithsonian, and so many others today so desperately want to preserve? Now, I've spent countless hours continuing to research this. And by the way, this is not in my book project. It's just something that I find so intriguing. And while the answer isn't perfectly clear, it has a kind of hazy outline. But before we get to what I think the answer to that big question might be and why I think it matters, I want to dig more into what exactly these early Jim Crow era activists were arguing. In 1901, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a 6-part series in the Southern Workman about Black housing in the South. Core to his argument was the fact, supported as it would be, of course, by Du Bois, with ample statistical evidence, that most Black Americans were still living in houses like ones they had occupied while they had been enslaved. Quote, in the country districts of the South, where 3/4 of the American Negroes live, the cramped one-room cabin continued to be the kind of house that now free Black Southerners lived in. And that one-room cabin was, according to Du Bois, the home which slavery bequeathed to freedom. The one-room cabin thus materially represented the enslaved past that by the time of Du Bois's writing in 1901 had morphed into the pernicious Jim Crow present, disfranchisement, segregation, lynching. Of course, the one-room cabin was a housing form not exclusively constructed or lived in by Black people, but the connection between the one-room cabin, slavery, and Blackness was ensconced in American culture, particularly Southern culture, by the mid-19th century. As I found in my dissertation research, which focused on cultural representations of Black American homes throughout the 19th century, artists, writers, and other cultural producers typically presented slave dwellings in the same light, usually a one-room log cabin, often dilapidated, often with a single disheveled, dirty, uncomfortable room, not inhabited by family, but by random individuals forced to make these terrible living conditions livable. And what I found, by the way, was that both abolitionist and pro-slavery writers alike typically use this one-room cabin to represent the living space of enslaved people, thereby creating this idea that there was a single housing type for enslaved men and women. Now, that was not true, by the way. There was a range of living conditions in the past for enslaved people, but that diversity was lost in part through propaganda that offered readers the easier to digest image of the slave cabin as a one-room log cabin. Now, of course, American culture associated other individuals and groups with log cabins. In particular, William Henry Harrison and Abraham Lincoln used log cabin imagery for political purposes. Yet the circulating images of slavery had, by at least the mid-19th century, also connected the log cabin with the peculiar institution. The idea and image of the small cabin as the single dwelling type for enslaved people circulated around the world, not just through popular illustrated books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, but also through, for instance, the material culture produced around the book and later play, including engravings, needlepoint, wallpaper, and as you can see here, transferware plates. And these often featured small log cabins as the singular slave dwelling. The presence of Black bodies, cotton fields, or particular phrases, often involving aunt or uncle in reference to Uncle Tom's Cabin, further linked such images to slavery. Now, after the legal end of slavery, cultural products like memoirs, novels, travelers' accounts, sketches, paintings, photographs, plays, postcards, very often pictured a small log cabin as the quintessential slave dwelling. So while this domestic form continued to be linked to the past of slavery, for decades after emancipation, as W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out, the majority of Black Southerners continued to live in one-room cabins similar to, or in many cases, the exact same as houses they had lived in under slavery. Let me reiterate, for decades after the end of slavery, architectural historians and archaeologists argue, free Black Southerners. Hi, sorry, whoever has their mic on, would you please mind muting? Thanks. So, architectural historians and archaeologists. Heather, would you be able to mute whoever has their mic undone?
Yes, I've got my eye on it. I'm trying to keep on top of it. Everyone's off right now, as far as I can see.
Okay, thank you. All right, third time reiterating, so you're really gonna get it this time. Free Black Southerners continued to live in houses that they had built and lived in during slavery. These were literal places of enslavement, just repurposed under the new tenancy or sharecropping systems that had developed after emancipation. These cabins, thousands of them dotting the postbellum Southern landscape, were not all identical, of course, but Black periodicals, conference proceedings, missionary and school reports, memoirs, photographs provide a general idea of living conditions for most Black Southerners in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We see typical descriptions of one-room cabins noting cramped, unclean, poorly ventilated, or overexposed living quarters with inadequate furnishings and a lack of privacy. Frances Ellen Harper described the one-room cabin she encountered while traveling throughout the South in the 1870s as often, quote, without a single window pane, where a whole family are living, parlor, chamber, and kitchen all combined in one. And if you want light, you open the door, and the light and air both enter through the cabins. Du Bois and the Southern Workmen described these as, quote, single rooms of logs or unsealed boards, with sometimes a small additional room without glass windows, without stoves, and with little furniture. These form the homes of the majority of the Negroes. Now, this same exact language had been used to describe slave dwellings throughout the South. So no wonder Du Bois argued that for contemporary Black Southerners, quote, the old slave cabin is still the prototype of the present homes, which continue to be one-room cabins. Now, still, at the turn of the 20th century then, as Reverend Morgan London Latta declared in his 1905 memoir, quote, it was a very common thing for our white friends to pass along the roads, and if they look towards the east or west or in any direction, and they see a log cabin, they will say nobody lives there but colored people. Latta, who founded a university in Raleigh, North Carolina to educate freedmen and orphans, further proclaimed that distancing contemporary Black Americans from the architectural form associated with slavery would serve not only individuals, but the entire race. While most enslaved men and women had been born in one-room cabins, Latta noted, quote, it is time for us as a race to improve our condition and forget the past and look forward to the future. Now, this language points to the framework within which Latta and so many of these Black activists were working: racial uplift and respectability politics. For decades after the abolition of slavery, some of the most prominent middle class and elite Black Americans argued that it was imperative for their brethren to lift themselves from the depths of their enslaved past into a new, brighter future of full freedom and rights. Mary Church Turrell, founder of the National Association of Colored Women, encapsulated their goal succinctly, quote, lifting as we climb. They believed this required Black Americans to clearly demonstrate their uplift from slaves to respectable citizens. From speech to clothing to houses, the visible and material evidence of progress was core to racial uplift and respectability politics. In his memoir, then, we see Latta employing a common visual trope meant to show his own individual progress as a Black man. He included an image of a small ramshackle log cabin meant to represent his past, as well as a photograph of a more refined dwelling with white paint, shutters, and significantly more square footage to demonstrate his present uplifted position. Other memoirists like Thomas Burton, Scott Bond, and Peter Bruner, all three of whom were born in slavery, they also contrasted pictures of the slave cabins of their childhood with photographs of the large, splendid homes acquired through, as they described it, their diligence, persistence, and talent. By visualizing the stark differences between their homes in slavery and in freedom, Black activists were drawing a stark line between the past and the present, arguing that they had progressed so far beyond slavery that it was impossible to withhold the rights of citizenship and freedom from them. Booker T. Washington, founder and principal of the Tuskegee Institute, likewise included an image of his birthplace, a ramshackle cabin, in his memoir. As Washington noted in a speech in 1896, quote, it was my privilege to start life at the point now occupied by most of my people in a small one-room log cabin on a slave plantation in Virginia. But that was the past. Washington's large two-story Queen Anne-style red brick home, known as the Oaks, functioned as Tuskegee's social center, an example to all who passed through the Institute that progress from slavery was not only possible, but very real. Seeing this kind of uplift through architecture was useful for these Black activists. By simply viewing, quote, these homes of a better class as they go to and from the school grounds, a reporter from the Outlook noted, they see what other men and women of their race have done and what they can do if they try. They didn't really need Washington's boyhood home, that small one-room cabin he occupied during slavery, next to his Oaks home, to make this argument. In the case of memoirists, the printed visual reminder of slavery was acceptable because there was an obvious image of uplift and success next to it or within pages of this standalone book. But in the actual landscape, what was more important was for people to see the progress and uplift of Black Americans. And the vast majority of actual one-room cabins in the Southern landscape did not have some imposing two-story home next to it to represent the uplift that came from the enslaved past. So whether ambivalent about or actively fighting against the continued presence of these small houses across the rural South, Black institutions and organizations began to call for the one-room cabins that so many had occupied in slavery and after to be replaced with larger homes, better suited for the free and equal people they wanted to be recognized as. As the 1895 Tuskegee Annual Conference stated bluntly, quote, "The one-room cabin must be torn down and a house with not less than 2 rooms take its place." Losing the architectural remains of slavery was not concerning to them. What was of concern was moving beyond the conditions of slavery. Now, a common belief of 19th century Americans was that the physical domestic space of the home shaped the character of the inhabitants. Early Jim Crow era Black activists agreed, arguing that the structure of the one-room cabin more than often created a bad environment for raising good children and good citizens. The one-room cabin, Alexander Crummell declared, has been the source and origin of countless immoralities. At the Home Missions Rally in 1896, Booker T. Washington connected the lack of privacy in one-room cabins to the poor state of religious and moral instruction, as he thought it, among his Black Americans. Quote, "What state of morality or practical Christianity you may expect when as many as 6, 8, and even 10 cook, eat, sleep, get sick, and die in one room, I need not explain." Likewise, Mary Church Turrell associated a 1901 op-ed in the Southern Workman that, quote, "When families of 8 or 10 men, women, and children are all huddled promiscuously together in a single apartment, a condition common among our poor all over the land, there is little hope of inculcating morality and modesty." Black male and female reformers therefore believed that this style of domestic architecture was a major culprit holding back the progress of the race. The participants at the 1890 Mohonk Negro Conference noted that the exchange of, quote, "the one-room cabin for a comfortable house of 3 or more rooms is a primary condition for securing self-respect and the respect of others and developing the moral character and safe citizenship." Respect, morality, citizenship. These were things that Black activists sought, that they thought were necessary for uplifting the race during this period of virulent racism and diminishing rights. But as these qualities were believed to be rooted in the home, they could actually only flourish in the right kind of home. From these Black activists' perspective, then, the past of slavery and its contemporary manifestations in Jim Crow policies and practices lingered in the one-room cabins of contemporary Black Southerners. They needed to move beyond the one-room cabin that not only represented the enslaved past, but seemed, through its very architectural form, to be keeping working-class Black Southerners in a subjugated state, unable to fully flourish and to prove that they were deserving of the equality and rights that were currently being denied to them in Jim Crow America. From the perspective of these Black activists and institutions, then, it was imperative to eliminate the one-room cabin and replace it with a more spacious, tidy, aesthetically pleasing home. Thus, the, quote, "abolishment of the one-roomed cabin and its attendant evils," as the Tuskegee Negro Conference proclaimed in 1896, became a central objective of reform-minded Black men and women. And for years, this would continue to be a primary objective of the well-attended and well-known annual Tuskegee Conference. But this wasn't the only group seeking to do away with the one-room cabin. That same year, in 1896, the National Association of Colored Women proclaimed a, quote, "vigorous crusade against the one-room cabin." 6 years later, in a speech at the 1902 Negro Young People's Education Congress, the urgency of this crusade was made clear. Quote, "The home is a citadel of strength, the castle of virtue and patriotism. Without it, both society and the state must crumble. With it, the high ideals of life must thrive. While home must not be judged by the height of the walls or the decorations thereof, still I am here to maintain that no families can be prepared for the battles of life with from 6 or 7 living in one room. There is progressive work to be done along this line. More rooms equals better homes. Building better individuals and families meant replacing one-room cabins with larger dwellings. There was no talk about preserving the architectural remains of slavery. The focus was on improving the conditions of Black Americans' home life now in the hopes of improving all areas of life for them in the future. Now, this crusade against the one-room cabin seemed to work to some extent. By 1898, Black Virginians in a town called Farmville had, quote, established a building and loan association made up of men of their own race, and are as rapidly as possible abandoning the old one-room cabin for frame houses with 2 or more distinct rooms. The Tuskegee Conference of that year noted, quote, constant growth in replacing the one-room cabin. A 1901 article entitled "One-Room Cabins Passing Away" described changes in rural Alabama, where one could, quote, clearly see that the Washington idea of doing away with the one-room cabin is largely put into practice. A year later, another Southern Workman article proclaimed that, quote, no greater evidence of progress, thrift, and prosperity can be found throughout the South than by the fact that the one-room cabin that once constituted the homes of the colored people have given way to neat, clean, well-painted cottages, comfortable, and in many instances, attractive homes. The politics of racial uplift, therefore, was changing the architecture of Black Americans' homes. And it was in part through this architectural evolution, focused overwhelmingly on rural working class Black Southerners, that the uplift of the entire race could actually begin from the perspective of those who were fighting for racial uplift and respectability politics. As Anna Julia Cooper noted in 1892, quote, we must point to homes, average homes, homes of the rank and file of horny-handed tolling men and women of the South, where the masses are, lighted and cheered by the good, the beautiful, and the true. Then, and not till then, will the whole plateau be lifted into the sunlight. As the mention of the masses makes clear, working class Black women and men were a key part of this crusade. But the language used to discuss the poverty and deprivation of Black one-room cabins sounded at times very similar to the patronizing discourse surrounding immigrant tenements in northern cities at the same time. This kind of language ignored the realities of life for working class people, extreme poverty, lack of resources, lack of time, that made adhering to middle-class standards absolutely impossible. Middle class and elite individuals called on working class folks to recognize, quote, the importance of giving more time to their home life, when in fact, very few had any more time to give. Additionally, the emphasis on home uplift, like uplift more broadly, ignored the reality of respectability politics as a powerful method of distinguishing us from others, of affirming class hierarchies, even within the Black community. In fact, it was very soon after Black activists and organizations called for the abolishment of the one-room cabin that the Black historic preservation movement actually began. Britt Leggs pinpoints the start of Black historic preservation with the quest to save the house of Frederick Douglass, the most famous 19th century Black American whose own success was symbolized in his home known as Cedar Hill. In 1915, the National Association of Colored Women, that very same organization that had called for the vigorous crusade against the one-room cabin 2 decades before, they spearheaded the effort to preserve Douglass's impressive and imposing mansion. Now, I want to wrap up by offering some thoughts on what all of this means, what this story contributes to our understanding of the past, of race, historic preservation, and American architecture. First, I think comparing these early Jim Crow era Black activists' one-room cabin crusade to that of 21st century slave cabin preservationists is actually really illuminating. It seems like, in fact, both wanted the same thing, but they just approached it very differently. Both groups thought architecture could help them in their quest to establish a more equitable and just America, where their rights as citizens were upheld and their value as humans respected. For Black activists at the turn of the 20th century, though, they thought the best way to do that was not to preserve or even to seek a usable history through that architecture, but to move beyond history and abandon most of the material remnants of their enslaved past that still dotted the Southern landscape. Only those houses that clearly showed the progress and success of Black Americans, houses with multiple stories and rooms, with windows flanked by shutters, with paint and well-maintained exteriors, only these deserved preservation. The story that these improved Black houses told served a clear purpose for these early Jim Crow era Black activists. They believed that uplift of the few would, in time, bring the entire race to their level, showing those who continued to oppress Black Americans that they were actually, in fact, deserving of the rights currently being denied to them. They didn't need to see the physical material remnants of slavery, the one-room cabin, to have those success stories in architectural form be useful to their contemporary political project. Instead, those still surviving houses of slavery seemed only to hold back the race. These activists therefore suggested that one-room cabins couldn't serve as usable history, and instead simply served as a reminder of slavery, and more importantly, as an indication from their point of view, that many Black Southerners had been unable to move past the past and into lives as respectable, upright citizens. Now, 21st century preservationists viewed these one-room cabins in a very different light. For them, slave cabins provide a usable history, one that must not be destroyed or ignored if we are to make a better America for all. I think this story and its comparison to contemporary activism then begins to help us think through how Black Americans relate to architecture and how they see its power and use during times of increasing political, economic, and social adversity. Additionally, I think it helps us grapple with how the racial politics of particular moments shape historic preservation, how they shape what is and is not preserved. Now, there were several differences between these two groups, the past and the present, but I think one particularly important one to consider, and which may tell us something about preservation, is generational. In the 1890s, many Black Americans not only remembered slavery, they had lived it. Why would anyone want to preserve a building they had been enslaved in? In fact, it wasn't until the mid-20th century, once most formerly enslaved people had died, that we see the early origins of the slave cabin preservation movement with the push to preserve the slave era boyhood home of Booker T. Washington. As we contemplate the history of historic preservation, then we need to ask how generational distance from the buildings in question mattered to the people seeking to conserve them, or seeking not to conserve them in the case of early Jim Crow era Black activists. Additionally, when we do preserve one-room cabins today, we should be telling this whole story, not just about what it was like to live in them during slavery or tenancy, but what it was like for Black Americans to move out of them or demolish them. While it's true that, as Brent Leggs puts it, quote, the African-American preservation movement recognizes the long tradition we stand on and the responsibility of honoring the past legacies of so many, it seems the movement has yet to really grapple with this more complicated history of the early preservation or non-preservation, preservation, anti-preservation, I don't know what to call it yet, activities of Black Americans. So as we preserve, perhaps we should also think about the full story of the one-room cabin, about when at least some Black Americans saw it as a hindrance to their freedom struggle and sought to not preserve. And this therefore suggests something else to me. Sometimes anti or non-preservation was the right legitimate choice, even for communities who ardently wanted to have themselves represented in the narrative and fabric of American life. An interesting corollary could be the dismantling of segregated spaces after the successes of the civil rights movement. The disappearance and unpreservation of these spaces was intentional. It was a part of desegregation. It was important for those trying to make real the promises of this supposedly more equal society. Unpreservation was as much a political project as preservation, whether in 1892 or 1972. At the same time, our nation in 2022 is not the same as 1972 or 1892. I concur with Joe McGill, Joby Hill, and the Smithsonian that we today need the material remnants of slavery, even if those in earlier eras did not. As historic preservationist Robert Weymouth argues, quote, "It may be time to begin thinking in a systematic way about preserving the architecture of segregation in all its forms." And we can apply this to so many difficult histories of our nation: slavery, tenancy, convict leasing, colonization, removal, reservations, internment camps, and more. In other words, what we consider usable history and what we feel we should and should not be preserved because of it, this can and will change over time. Historians and preservationists today see slave cabins clearly as usable history, even if Black activists in the past, living in a different moment than ours, did not. So as people today work to preserve extant slave cabins, I think it's also time for us to really begin thinking how we can recover some of those one-room cabins that have long been gone from the Southern landscape. We could physically rebuild the cabins like they're doing at Montpelier. We could digitally recreate them like they're doing at Varner Hog Plantation here in Texas. Could use augmented reality to set them back in the landscape like they do at Highland Plantation. All of these things and more are being attempted by historic sites. And I, for one, look forward to getting out of that musty basement archive and into the world to see them. Thanks so much for listening, y'all. And I really look forward to hearing what you have to say and all of your feedback.
Thank you so much. There's lots to, I think, discuss and think about. I'd like to invite everyone to turn your video on, even if you don't plan on talking. It's just nice to see faces rather than the blank screen. And as you're all sort of turning on your video, if you have questions or you're sort of thinking about questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can do the little hand raise thing. As everyone's sort of joining us, I'm wondering, Whitney, if you could, since maybe not everyone has been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is wonderful. If you're in DC, you should absolutely make the effort to get the tickets and stand in the line and do the whole thing to get there. It's a hot ticket in town. I'm wondering if you can describe for everyone how that object, that enormous object, fits into the exhibition, where it is, how it sort of, because there's a real narrative in that museum, and that is sort of in the middle. And I'm wondering if you could tell everyone a little bit more about that object, what it's like to walk through it, and sort of how it fits into the larger exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, now that you're asking me this, I'm thinking back to Mary Church Turleward's Lifting as We Climb, because literally the slave cabin is at the bottom of a multi-level museum. So the bottom level in which you go in first, you move chronology from the farthest point in the past to the most recent. So you literally are moving upwards in time. You are moving from a slave cabin at the very bottom. You're moving from the era of slavery upwards through the era of Jim Crow, civil rights movement, to the more contemporary era. And there are different topics and themes that are addressed throughout, but you literally are being lifted as you climb. And that's something that maybe I should kind of think about. I mean, of course, people who put together the museum are very aware of the limits of respectability, politics, and uplift. And that's something that, needs to be said. This is a kind of flawed political project in many ways. So they are aware of that, but it is interesting that as we move from the era of slavery and from this physical object of a slave cabin, you move upwards in time and space to a kind of different moment. And there is a celebratory element to the museum, and there's supposed to be, and I think there should be in a way. But then there are also these very clear moments of, there are these clear, not only moments, but continuity of subjugation, oppression, resistance, and the kind of toggle between agency resistance and oppression and subjugation.
And you are sort of forced to walk into it, if I recall, in order to move through the entire exhibition. So you can't ignore it and you can't avoid it. And it is a powerful, very tight space in there. I mean, you're kind of bumping into people as well. So it's so interesting to hear how badly they work to acquire that and preserve that as a part of that exhibition, which I need to revisit. But surely other people have comments and questions, so please jump in. We're a pretty small group, so you could just start talking or do a hand raise or do the chat, and I'm happy to read your question as well. Yes, Virginia. You're on mute.
Mute, great.
Got it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart and the University of Texas at Dallas. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, and am familiar with the slave cabin from Point of Pines plantation on Edisto Island here. And if I remember correctly, though, it's actually at the very beginning of the journey, not the middle. But if I'm not mistaken, you enter that cabin on the bottom floor at the beginning.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to clarify that. Also, I was interested, Dr. Stewart, and I don't want to divert us from the one-room slave cabin, but I couldn't help thinking about the praise houses across the Sea Islands, particularly in South Carolina and Georgia, perhaps elsewhere, which are very modest structures, but of course they are much more of a community structure and represent so much. But I was interested in the fact of their status and whether more of those have been preserved than the one-room cabins.
It's a great question. I don't know. That's something that, I would love to. I'll probably email Joe about, because I mean, Joe McGill he's a historical consultant for Magnolia
Right.
Plantation in South Carolina. And I'm sure he would know a bit more about that, but at least from the perspective of the historical elements that I was talking about today of the late 19th and early 20th century, I definitely don't see much conversation about anything beyond domestic spaces, so dwellings. That's not to say that there wasn't any conversation about it. Paul Laurence Dunbar, for instance, the poet, wrote a lot about different structures on plantations, kind of deserted plantations and what they represented for him. But not necessarily those activists and institutions I was talking about today. And in terms of the kind of broader Black preservation movement, my assumption would be that, yeah, they're going to be really interested in making sure that structures like praise houses, also, kind of more everyday structures like tobacco barns or stables, even, enslaved laboring places are of interest for preservationists, not just the living spaces. And the National Park Service has given a whole bunch of money and created a kind of a side or a corollary institution specifically for African-American preservation. And so I think there's, in the past 5 years or so, been much more concerted effort to preserve these multiple kinds of spaces and not just dwellings. That's a great question, though. I will seek out more information about those praise houses. They're also just, yeah, you're right. They're so interesting. And the Sea Islands, it's, in a way, it's its own thing, but it's still very much a part of this history. Thanks.
Anyone else?
I could jump in here. Hi, thank you so much, Whitney. That was fascinating. I particularly liked the analogy that you made with tenements, because it seems to me that we also have a paucity of tenement housing that's been preserved, with the exception of the Tenement Museum in New York, which sort of leads to the question of, if historic preservation is grounded in using the past for the present, we go out of our way to ignore poverty, violence, absolutely inadequate spaces for both living and working, in terms of that which we deem preservable or worth preserving. So it might be worth expanding on, well, what is the historic preservation movement really all about? We don't want to recall, remember, retrieve, or preserve the dire circumstances of poverty for folks living in the city or folks living in farming areas. So, I mean, it's surprising what has survived. And, we could apply this as well to factories, spaces where, where we've toiled. They're ruins, but few and far between have actually been preserved. So just something to think about.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think, we can go beyond tenements and even factories. I have friends or colleagues that are looking at, preservation of Native American spaces. I have a friend who wrote a dissertation that one chapter looked at internment camps. These are spaces that we really don't want to remember that have been easily torn down. I think there's also another point to this that I kept thinking about, but I can't figure out how to integrate it, which is sometimes people, I was at the Henry Ford Museum, and in Greenfield Village, they have randomly 2 South Carolina slave cabins because Henry Ford thought he needed, I guess, literally every single kind of building in America. And so he just got brought up and brought over to Michigan, 2 slave cabins. And I remember just, walking around Greenfield Village one day when I didn't want to be doing my work. I love being at museums because you just walk around instead of doing your work. It's wonderful. Procrastination. And I was listening to some visitors who were in the slave cabin, and they were looking around and they were like, this isn't that bad. And then as well, the kind of tenements museum point, my husband went to visit the Tenements Museum when he was living in New York 10 years ago. And when he went to the Tenements Museum, he was like, I would love to have a place this size in New York City, right? Because we bring ourselves into these places, and even when they are preserved, they can't actually give us what it was actually like to be in that level of, poverty and kind of all of that. It's really hard to preserve not only the building, but the kind of feeling of actually living in that time and place. So I think there's more, maybe that's more about interpretation and kind of curatorial ideas than it is preservation. But I think there's something there about the way that we relate to these spaces today, being so far removed. Again, that kind of generational question of how far are you removed from the thing? Because if you were living in a 1-room cabin, I think you'd probably be like, heck yes, I'd like more rooms, please, thank you. And you'd be fine getting rid of that 1-room cabin. It's not like you were thinking of it as this architectural memorial to the enslaved past or something. So I'm going to look more into the tenement side and think a little bit more about how we ignore poverty and yet seek to preserve it at particular times and places. I think that's great. Thank you, Erica.
I have a question building off of that if no one else has a question. So I thought this was awesome, so exciting. And I love the way you put what I'm seeing. It was actually kind of not totally aligned conversation between the Jim Crow era activists with preservationists today. And I think you're absolutely right. It's super illuminating and super important. But it does also tell me, though, right, that the Du Bois and Washington and Terrell are engaging in a different set of politics and a different set of problems, right, than preservationists today, right? The question was about, right, they actually wanted to address the conditions of impoverishment, right, and they were not as concerned about historical preservation, right? That was not necessarily the question. I have a historian's question, so I apologize. It's a material question. But thinking through the tenements, right, in many cases, particularly in the North, which is what I know better, these tenements were raised by the state, right, to produce different buildings, right? And that in itself is a history of displacement, right? Even as the tenements were being bulldozed, right, they're actually not creating better housing for the original inhabitants, right? It was either for whatever, unlivable downtown spaces in the cities or better middle class housing that would be unaffordable or out of reach for the original inhabitants. So who was doing the raising of these cabins and for what purpose?
Thank you, Annie. This is something else that I am trying to figure out where and how to talk about. So for those who were living in kind of cycles of tenancy or sharecropping, these houses were not their own. They were owned by the overwhelmingly white landowners. And so Booker T. Washington has speeches where he, tries to talk directly to the landowners and be like, you need to start improving the houses. And so there's a way in which Black activists seem to be like calling on working class Black Southerners to do a thing that they're not entitled to do in a way. I think from what I can kind of pull together, I don't think the landowners would have cared if it was a 1-room cabin or a 10-room cabin, but they weren't going to put any money in it themselves. So it was something that if it wanted to be improved, it would have to be funded by the working class Black Southerners. We do see Washington says some landowners in the South starting to put more money into this housing. It wasn't, at the state level doing the raising, but it seems to be that at least in some of these situations, it was like, we're going to call on working class Black Southerners to do this thing, but we're also need to put, some focus onto the white landowners. And then who actually does it? I haven't found any evidence of, particular instances where people are saying like, my employer did this for me, or I went ahead and did this thing, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a great question. And it's one that I'm gonna be thinking about how to kind of incorporate that complication in it. Thank you.
Whitney, sorry, it was my mic that was on in between. I thought it was automatically muted. I apologize, but I was wondering about the timber itself. Where are they sourcing kind of? And I was 5 minutes late, so I don't know if you mentioned this at the beginning, but what are the kind of the materials that they're like? Where are they sourcing the timber from? Is that imported from somewhere else? I mean, are they? Is it cedar? Like what? Just sort of the physical materials of what goes into building these single room cabins. It's a blunt, just basic question.
Yeah, so since most of these 1-room cabins were actually built during the era of slavery, I have a little bit more, a little firmer grip on what it would be, which is it's local. So often if it's a medium or large plantation, there will sometimes be there will sometimes be the availability of timber from the actual plantation, or it would be, often a plantation would sit next to either a river or some kind of water source. And so they'd be able to get timber from a close area and just bring it down. But then I also, have read many different, and it's not just timber, by the way, there's stone and brick. So we see in Varner Hogg Plantation in southwest Texas, southeast Texas, southwest of Houston, they make the brick on site. So the brick that builds the big house also builds the slave cabins. So a lot of this stuff is just, a plantation is in a way a kind of insular village where work and where labor and living happens, and most things or a lot of things at least, can be produced there. But we do see increasingly into like the 1840s and 50s, like the shelling out for factory made nails and things like that. But for these kind of big projects with the big materials, we do see them tending to be more local.
More local, perfect. And just when you mentioned brick, I'm amazed. Would there be a direct aesthetic, like a purposefully different sort of othering of the bricks used that would make it different from the main house of the plantation? Or, and this might not be something that came up, but I'm thinking about the whole complex and how these, like, they're kind of part of the whole, but they want them to be separate as well. So aesthetically, would they have consciously made them look different if it was the same sort of brick to brick material? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just the physical houses themselves were so clearly different that, when you have a 2-story hall and parlor plan house versus 1-room cabins on the other side of the creek, right next to the sugar house in the instance of Varner Hogg, that kind of both form difference and physical distance help to create those distinguishing characteristics. But we do see, one cool thing about brick in particular is we get thumbprints all over the place. And so we get these almost like, artist signatures of enslaved people who made these bricks and then put them into the houses.
Amazing. Wow. Yeah, different. Thank you. This is so fascinating to me, especially the idea that you talked about, sort of the generational gap and what it means to one generation. And then as you move out, and the further you get from the original experience, the meaning can change and it loses its power over time, but then gains power back again. And I just wonder, in 2021, I mean, like, just looking back and thinking about cabins, like, I think about them in such a different aspect. And I appreciate this talk so much. It was perfect from the angle of material culture. Thank you.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Thanks for coming. Ashley.
Hello. Jumping off of what Professor Alibi was talking about with differentiating housing materials, one of the pictures you showed of the slave houses was white, like white painted wood. Is that an aesthetic choice of current people, or were these places supposed to look like the main house in some way aesthetically to like make the whole property look one way, or was there a distinction to make those pieces of those homes to look different?
Yeah, so whitewashing, lime wash was used on slave cabins, and it was something that was done typically twice a year, and it was for hygiene purposes more than anything. And so if like the big house was painted white, which big houses were also whitewashed, but if a big house was painted white and then the slave cabins were whitewashed, which of course comes off over time, but leaves that kind of that light white exterior, then there would be that similarity. But for slave cabins, at least, if there was typically a kind of, if it was white, it was because either the brick or the wood or the logs, whatever it is, was whitewashed, and was a requirement by enslavers for their enslaved laborers to perform this kind of work to ensure that they would stay healthy, because they were an investment that needed to be kept healthy.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Jessica,
Virginia, did you have another? Oh,
sorry.
sorry. No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Virginia, did you have another comment or question?
Only that one other material you see occasionally in the Low Country, and I know Dr. Stewart is aware of it, is tabby.
Yeah.
We have some enslaved dwellings made of a combination of oyster shell and water and lime and so forth.
It's incredible. I mean, that stuff stays too. It's a hardy material. Extremely, yeah. Improvisational brilliance. Jess.
Okay, me? Yes, okay. So thank you. This is really, really fascinating. Of course, I knew it would be, but I actually, while listening to you, of course, I'm deep in dissertation research and such, but I see a lot of parallels between this conversation and kind of the debate over incorporation in general into, for instance, into a canon versus highlighting individualized minority groups. Do we highlight that there is inequality and call attention to it, or do we do more damage by separating it out? I encounter this a lot in the art world because people will say, by separating artists out into an exhibition of Texas art or women artists, or are we doing more damage by doing that, by highlighting them as separate? So this idea of kind of Black people saying we can't succeed with the one room cabin still existing, still being there because because of its representation. So I am just out of sheer curiosity, because I agree with you, I think they should be preserved. But that all being said, what do you think specifically are the things that we can learn from these houses themselves? Like, if we were to preserve only one or two of them or all of them, like what would the things be that we can really take away from that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one reason that I think more than one or two need to be preserved is because of the incredible variation in living conditions and spaces for enslaved people. Our propensity in this country to condense complicated histories down into like a single factoid, or a single dwelling type for enslaved people, and slavery was like this everywhere for everyone. It just is not only false, but I think it does a disservice to the kind of political project that people have today of showing the ways in which a variety of experiences of slavery have shaped not only Black Americans, but all Americans today. Thinking about things like urban slave dwellings being preserved. People don't think that slavery existed in cities. I go to a place like New Orleans and I'm like, y'all, it's everywhere. You see that building, you see that building, that's a slave dwelling, that's a slave dwelling. And just the kind of ignorance and inability to see how this is still present in our landscape, and thus by seeing that it's still present and hopefully preserving it, how the labor and lives of the people who were there then affected, then shaped this very city, this very nation, right? It's all about like what the Slave Dwelling Project is trying to do, of like, we preserve these buildings, not just to keep them, but to use them to integrate our stories into the American narrative. And, I think in 2010, when Joe McGill founded the Slave Dwelling Project, it was important. But in 2022, when we have people burning books and we have people demanding that certain kinds of history, particularly as it relates to things like slavery, is not told to our students and our young people or anyone, it's even more important that we make sure that we preserve these kinds of spaces, because even though we tend to believe things more if they're written down, at the same time, people can be like, I don't believe it. It's just not. But when you can when there's that physical thing and that visceral nature of something, if it's interpreted well, not like at Henry Ford. If it's interpreted well, then it can really do something positive. I mean, we hope can do something positive to change people's perspective about not only the past, but the way that the past has shaped the present, and the importance of maintaining that.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? There certainly are a lot of cultural heritage issues that we deal with at the O'Donnell Institute, whether it's through archaeology in the sort of larger global sense, or closer to home. But I think that, you know, thinking about these things through this case study, thinking about the larger issues through this case study that you've presented tonight is really compelling. I mean, you've given me a lot to think about, especially as it relates to the sort of culture wars that we've been in for the past couple of years and probably will continue to be in. So I appreciate that perspective, and some issues that I hadn't considered. Is there anyone else with questions or comments? Erica? Oh, wait, you're off again. You're muted again.
Yep. Okay, this is a bit of an aside, but it might be interesting. As I was listening to you, I was thinking of an artist, Beverly Buchanan, who was an African-American artist who made small and sort of medium-sized sculptures based on the one-room slave shack and the one-room sharecropper shack. And so if you just looked a little bit into her work, some of it's fascinating because she, in her early work in the mid-'80s, recovered the sort of tabby construction materials, working with them, which I thought was fascinating. And she just might be an interesting artist to look at who is thinking about the rapid disappearance of this particular kind of vernacular architecture in the South. But I wanted to say too, what you were just saying about why we preserve more than one or two, because of the regional diversity. There's such a difference between the kind of one-room shack that was built in, let's say, the Delta, one-room shack that was built in Texas, and it's all going to depend on what kind of lumber, what kind of rock, brick, what kind of materials are going to exist. And just saying that gives you an indication of how resourceful the people living in those properties had to be in order to create them and maintain them. So sure, they might have been put up by master, but they were maintained by the people who lived in them. So it's just something to think about in terms of the agency actually of the folks living in those spaces.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And absolutely, I'm gonna check out Beverly Buchanan's work. It sounds fascinating, just period, but it does actually seem like something that would contribute to this. So thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. I wish we were headed to our reception afterwards, but I hope that you will join us for other events this semester. And please, follow us on social media, and although we're not on Twitter or anything like that, but follow along, and I hope to see you in the future. And thanks again, Dr. Stewart. This was a great talk, and it was nice to see all of you.
So great. Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Heather and Eodia, for the opportunity.
Thanks. You guys have a nice night.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.